Everyone knows about the bike test. It changes the degree of development of our logical intelligence. But is there such a test for imagination? For our imaginative intelligence? And in fact it exists, but there is no such test that could be answered by answering any questions, but it can be measured. Just simulate something in your imagination, that is, close your eyes and imagine something and try to see it in outlines, bright details, colors, and so on. Similar. And you can have both a high imagination, both medium and low. But today we are breaking about those people who have too low IQ imagination and too high IQ genius. Just, let's go. Let's start with the fact that imagination is a powerful psychic ability of a person, and no one else on planet Earth has such an imagination as he does. And even Einstein believed that imagination is more important than knowledge. I wonder why. It does not possess any neural tools, but only relies on our senses. For example, how one patient P had a damaged part of the brain that is responsible for color perception, and when he was asked to imagine snow in front of him, he could not tell what color it was. Also, studies in which using scanners have shown that when a person imagines a sound, he tries to hear, visualize, create, so to speak, in his imagination, to activate the dry zone of the brain, as if he hears this sound right now in reality. The imagination of VPM is quite an interesting thing when you especially see such results. But even more interesting is that each person has his own IQ imagination. You can change it right here easily. And you don't have to take any test, just imagine something. Well, I already talked about this at the beginning, of course. But now about those people who have too low, that is, almost zero, and those who have too high, that is, the master's grant level. Zero imagination is a fantasy. It is when a person does not see anything, that is, he tries to imagine something, closing his eyes, and he sees nothing. My eyes. I can't see anything. What have you done? What have you done? Such a feature can manifest itself from birth or after he has had any complicated surgery or any mental abnormalities. For the first time, fantasy was diagnosed in 1880. That is, it appeared not so long ago, and since then it has been studied very well, and with the help of which it was found out that this is not a pathology at all, it is just a feature of perception that can manifest itself from birth and after a person did not notice it in any way and did not pay attention to it, and the person just thought that everyone had it that way. That is, they can all imagine and see it in their imagination, any object. Also, quite recently, in June 2020 year, it turned out that fantasy is connected not only with imagination, that is, imagine the figurative, but also with memory, of course. And in the same study, 667 people were interviewed, among whom 267 diagnosed themselves with a fantasy. 1,300 people were normal, such normal, clear guys. Guys are guys in general. And even after the test, when people diagnosed themselves with a fantasy, they themselves thought that they really could not reproduce in their imagination what was offered to them. That is, any events. For example, to remember the dawn when they went to school, university, or went to work, they were offered coffee. And at the same time, the most interesting thing is that a person not only could not imagine the event that was offered to them, but also remember the last time they observed this event. That's it. Memory suffers greatly. That is, imagination is, in fact, such a memory booster. And there are not so many science fiction writers. And science fiction writers are only up to 3% of the population of our planet. But there are those people who have a very bright and almost limitless imagination, like, for example, you could see this IQ scale, like where a font is at the very beginning of this table, and these creative leaf is somewhere at the end. That is, it's 150 or more IQs, so to speak. If we compare it with the IQ test for logic. In fact, a person's creative potential depends on his proximal and distal modeling. And since these terms are new, so I'll explain right away. Proximal modeling is such a simple imagination when you perform some mundane action. That is, you can imagine how you will meet in the morning and make yourself a coffee, for example. That is, almost everyone can handle it. But distal modeling is a completely different thing. This is when you can imagine and be transported in your imagination to your imaginary world completely different from ours. That is, you can imagine when you are in Olympus half cyborg and 50 years later. Not everyone will be able to imagine such a thing, and even more so to see it. In other words, a person's creative potential depends on his ability to fly as far as possible in his imagination from the real world. And such abilities can only be possessed by a person whose brain reflection works differently than most, and there are a little more imaginates than science fiction writers and about 6% of their population. Also, of course, a study was conducted in which both people of technical professions participated, and people of creative professions also participated with them. These are writers, artists, directors. And in the first two tests, in which you see here on the diagram, this is BC. The first is that you don't have to look, it's purely like them. How successful they are in life, so to speak. And in these two tests, the BC showed that distal modeling is much more developed in creative people. Then the authors of the experiment decided to get to the bottom of it, and how do they differ from ordinary people? How does this creative elite surpass an ordinary person? And then they did the distal proximal modeling test again, and at the same time they scanned their brains. In tests for proximal modeling, the brains of both group worked almost the same. But when it came to distal modeling, then there was a very big difference between ordinary people and this creative elite. That's how it looks like. For distal modeling of the creative, a special subsystem of the brain was used, which ordinary people did not use, namely the dorsomedial subsystem of the passive mode network. It is associated with the imagination of intentions, with the creation of high-level constructions, abstractions, and understanding of narratives and concepts. And such a testing result surprised everyone enough, because everyone thought that such creators used only the same brain system that ordinary people used, they just had it trained, but it turns out they used a completely different brain subsystem. But this does not mean that an ordinary person without distal modeling could not avoid those who have such distal modeling, because we all create something from what we have ever seen and heard. And steel modeling contributes to the development of not only individual creativity, but especially collective. So, for example, one person invented elves, dwarves, dragons, and now they are used in almost all fantasy. And nothing, it's fine. Such people with distal modeling are only engines of creative progress, and that's it. But in fact, they are not the main creators of it, which are ordinary people. That's it for today. Thank you all for watching. If you liked this video, it was interesting for you, then just like it and subscribe to the channel, because it is unique to release videos on self-development, psychology, and many interesting things. Well, as usual, we are getting better than we were yesterday. See you soon.